Hello, everybody. I'm Ido Gal from the University of Haifa in Israel. Thanks for staying for the last session. I'm even laster than the last speaker. My family is watching me on streaming on Jesus, so hi to everybody. So I have a different kind of paper that also reflects some reviews, literature reviews, but from a different perspective. I have a pretty long title, which refers to the need to take a critical look at academic studies that are published in journals as opposed to technical reports and research reports that come from specialized centers such as GSIS, such as central banks, such as central bureaus of statistics and so on, but academic studies that are published in journals. And as we just heard, many of these studies in journals are published as a one-shot journal. A doctoral student or somebody is doing research, they don't necessarily know the literature very well, they jump in, they do some analysis and so on. And there is a lot of research that is accumulating, and we need to make sure as part of the infrastructure of PIAAC and OECD and interested countries to improve the quality of publications and the conclusions in them and so on. So my lenses, I've been involved in international assessments for 25 years or so. I served as the chair of the Numeracy Expert Group in the first cycle of PIAAC. I've been serving as the chair of the National Steering Committee in Israel for the last 13 years. So I also bring in the interests of the national level actors, ministries of education, labor, and so on, and clients of the data from PIAAC that are interested in extracting maximum value for these kinds of publications. So there are several concerns that I want to share with you regarding the design and how researchers understand what you need to know about the design of PIAAC, and I will try to go beyond points that were raised earlier in the sessions that I attended here. And I will talk about some of the implications for future research. And part of my talk is also helped by a research review, a scoping review that I published last year at ZDM Mathematics Education. It's one of the top journals in mathematics education, and it looked at adult education in mathematics and numeracy. So only numeracy, not literacy, but it also captured some PIAAC studies that were published in journals in these areas. And so I want to speak about 5 topics very briefly. First one, perhaps the most important, I think, is the connection between literacy and numeracy, which has been raised in a few presentations here, but I want to go beyond them. I will talk briefly about the tendency for many researchers to analyze whole samples, a whole national sample, and so on, which seems obvious, but I think carries with it some dangers. We'll talk briefly about the measurement of practices, which many researchers refer to, either as a predictor or as a criterion, something that you want to predict, and so on. If there is time, I will say a few words about the linking of results to policy and to practice. And I may say a few words also at the end on the contribution of PIAAC-related studies to the specific area of mathematics education at the school level and adult numeracy or adult mathematics education at the adult level. And my thoughts are evolving. I'm changing them a little bit as I hear more presentations and so on. So I'm not 100% sure about some of the conclusions, and feel free to disagree and raise questions and so on and so forth. So let's start with the topic that I think is most important, literacy and numeracy connections, because these are the 2 most central foundational skills that are measured by PIAAC in this cycle, in the last cycle, in PISA. We try to talk about them a lot. So they are positioned as independent constructs, as independent topics. The separate conceptual frameworks that describe them. I was involved in the design of these together with my good friend Dave Taut here and other people. And virtually all studies treat literacy and numeracy as separate entities. It seems obvious. But there is a very high correlation between them that we need to pay attention to. And before I continue, I've begun to do some work with two dear colleagues, Daphne Greenberg from Georgia State University and Keiko Yasukawa from University of Technology, Sydney in Australia, trying to look further into issues regarding the connection between literacy and numeracy. Daphne is a literacy expert and Keiko is a literacy and numeracy expert. So we are trying to create a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary group to look at it in more detail. And so let's look at the numbers first, okay? Published information. First two lines, the correlation between literacy, numeracy, and cycle 2 of PIAAC is 0.88. 0.88. This is the largest or highest correlation that you will almost ever see between any two measurements anywhere, okay? And in cycle 1, the correlation was between 0.82 to 0.90 because we have information from different countries. And I want to show you, before I go down the table, the actual publications. So in cycle 1, this is how it looks. On page 266 of the international report, you see a table with the numbers for each one of the countries. And in cycle 2, on page 57, and surprisingly, Andreas Schleicher, just before me, presented exactly this visualization, okay? So very high correlation. But in addition, there are some additional sources of information. For example, a study by Lechner from GISIS and some colleagues measured the literacy-numeracy connection in two separate studies or using two different types of instruments, found the same general correlation of 0.87. In a very recent study using a different assessment, EPAS, which is the successor to the LAMP assessment that was designed many years ago by the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning in order to assess basic skills in low and medium income countries. Reported a correlation of 0.73. This is through personal communication with the Romanian researcher that has conducted these studies. So these are really, really high correlations, and there are very good reasons for these correlations. We have known about them for a long time. If we look further in history into the conceptual foundations of the measurement of prose, document, and quantitative literacy produced by Irvin Kersh and Peter Mosenthal, we know that there are a lot of arguments about why literacy and numeracy are supposed to be related to each other. And so the 3 or 4 typical arguments that are provided for why literacy and numeracy are highly correlated are that many numeracy items have literacy content. You need to read and you need to interpret information in text and so on. Some literacy items have a numeracy content, such as in a table or in a visualization and so on. In addition, there are general background variables that affect both of these variables together. And finally, there are lurking variables, other ones. The most well-known one is a general intelligence, questionable construct, but there are some strong arguments regarding the fact that intelligence is affecting performance on literacy and numeracy measurements. Yet, many researchers dump both literacy and numeracy into the same multivariate analysis, such as a regression analysis and so on. They treat both of them as if they are independent, and they put both of them together into the same analysis. Some researchers try to look at profiles, how literacy and numeracy in combination can be used in order to predict some classifications and help policymakers or educators place learners in different kinds of groups. And there are two general concerns regarding it. First one, of course, is multicollinearity, a very well-known statistical issue that I've learned about 40 years ago when I finished my master's degree, that when you have a very high correlation between variables, and usually when we talk about a very high correlation in multicollinearity in educational and psychological measurements, we are talking about 0.5, 0.6. We are not even talking about 0.7 or 0.8. So the assumption is that high multicollinearity affects the stability of the measurements, increases measurement error creates a situation where variables can go in and out of regression equations, and sometimes you reach the wrong conclusions regarding which variable explains more variance compared to the other variable. So the bottom line is that multicollinearity is a danger that every researcher is supposed to worry about. And in many PIAAC studies that I look at that are published in journals, we don't see attention to this kind of issue when we talk about the usage of literacy and numeracy measures. So it's both the researchers that are not aware of this and the reviewers that are not aware of this. And I think that one important responsibility that we have as an OECD or an international body that is producing these measurements, as well as operators or actors at the national level, is to make sure that researchers are aware of this and they apply corrective measures. And there are several ways to deal with it. None of them is perfect, but there are ways to reduce the problems. I will refer to it later on. The other problem, of course, is interpretive. You may come up with wrong conclusions and wrong recommendations regarding what needs to be done in the field if you assume that you can freely make recommendations regarding the need to educate or apply certain educational interventions to people at certain levels of literacy and numeracy when you refer to them together in multivariate analysis or in regression analysis and so on. So this is an issue that needs to be addressed, I think, in future research, and I'm calling attention to it here. The last session of the conference, but it needs to be well known. Second point that I want to raise is regarding the tendency for researchers to analyze data from PIAAC across all levels of proficiency, that is on full national samples. This seems obvious. We have data for thousands of people. We want to analyze everything. We want to increase the statistical power of our analysis, and we want to reach conclusions that refer to the whole population. Yet, first of all, we know that literacy, low literacy, is affecting performance on the other measurements. So even if you look only at problem solving, for instance, adaptive problem solving, the performance on the problem-solving assessment is affected by people's literacy performance, and so the people at the lower level the performance will be hampered or depends on the literacy performance and not on their adaptive problem solving. And so you need to be aware of these connections between the scales, and you probably need to do separate analysis for different groups and not necessarily put everybody in the same box. The other thing has to do with the preferences or the needs of policymakers. So there is a lot of attention here in this conference and in other conferences to people at the lowest level of proficiency, what we call level 1 or below level 1. But many policymakers are not interested in this group, but in the higher groups, level 2, level 3, level 4. These are the people who are the future of industry, the future of industrial progression and so on, and not necessarily the people who are at the lowest level, who might have lower IQ, learning disabilities, language deficiencies because they come from another country. They may be very proficient in the language of their home country, but not necessarily in the local country. And there are all sorts of issues because of which policymakers do not want a whole population analysis. They need to look at subgroups, and we need to make sure that we provide information that is useful for policymakers. The measurement of practices is very problematic in the sense that in PIAAC, as we know, we have, in numeracy at least, I'm also going to look at numeracy very briefly, we have 2 groups of 5 items that measure numeracy, and all of them refer to how people do certain actions in mathematics, calculate, generate numbers and so on, whereas many of the tasks that citizens face are interpretive ones. You need to read something. You need to understand a letter from your insurance or bank provider or a health provider and so on. So you need to be able to analyze practices related to how people interpret and read information that involves numerical information, and not just look at how people engage in certain mathematical actions. And in particular, the existing items that measure numeracy practices do not refer at all to understanding statistics. And if you look at the newspaper, and if you remember what happened during COVID, all the information in the media and so on, it was mostly statistical information and not purely mathematical information. So the practices, the measurement of practices is missing a lot of information. And this is by design. This is by design. Researchers are not aware of this. Many researchers, especially those that have a single shot study, that is a PhD student who's taken the PIAAC data and analyzed it, is not necessarily aware of the way specific items, specific scales are constructed or specific constructs are measured. People assume that they understand what practices mean, whereas practices, literacy practices and numeracy practices are much broader constructs. So I will skip some of the examples that I have here, and I will reach briefly the analysis that I did on adult numeracy and adult mathematics education. Just to mention that last year I published a paper that involves an analysis of 2,200 articles published in 22 journals, 15 in adult education and adult literacy, virtually all the well-known journals, and the 7 leading journals in mathematics education. And out of these, there were 15 papers that related to PIAAC data on numeracy. Okay? 15 papers out of 2,200 across 4 years. And all of them were published in adult-related journals. None of them were published in journals that relate to school education. This means that on average you have 4 papers per year. Okay? It means that if you read as a practitioner or as a researcher a journal on adult education in literacy, okay, on adult education in general, you are not likely to come across any publication that relates to numeracy, and you don't even know that there are information sources in this regard and important conclusions in this regard. And so PIAAC is not visible as much in terms of empirical results. There is more attention to PIAAC in terms of references. So people do refer to PIAAC as a source, but not necessarily analyze this data. There are many explanations for this. But the bottom line is that we still need to penetrate and reach a field that is supposed to benefit from understanding results and translating them to decisions in the field, but this is not happening right now. So I want to conclude, unfortunately I'm running out of time, with a few carefully selected messages, because I could have more on a closing slide. So I think that we need to do a better job at informing researchers regarding the way variables are defined and the care that they need to take in using them in specific types of statistical analysis. So I think that we need to have some kind of an executive summary regarding recommendations for researchers, how to use the PIAAC data properly. We don't have it right now. We have a huge technical documentation and a lot of very heavy PDFs, but we don't have brief information that people can use carefully. We need to pay much more attention to statistical analysis and do more nuanced analysis in specific subgroups, avoid big multivariate analysis, which, by the way, are very popular among economists that love to dump a lot of variables into big regression formulas and so on, but they don't have an explanatory power, and very often they don't even understand the variables. Some researchers do not even use the word numeracy, they call it mathematics. The moment you call it mathematics, you will see it in published articles, you lose the understanding of what is the difference between numeracy and why it relates to literacy and so on. And we need to think carefully about how to address the literacy-numeracy connections and other issues in future research. There was a session here on the future of PIAAC. I will not come back to this issue, but the bottom line is that we need to think carefully about the possibility of merging these constructs or creating a new scale that measures them in combination separately from scales that have them more apart, and do a much better job at covering a much broader range of issues in the practices. I will stop here. This is a rich topic. I have a longer list of targets, and I hope that by at least this limited list, I've contributed somehow to understanding where PIAAC and PIAAC research should go in coming years. Thank you.